I was in Hamilton 3 years ago in the same room. This was just in the wake of the war in Yugoslavia. And as you recall, many people, including people in progressive organizations, supported that war. In part, I think it had to do with a lack of understanding, but again, we were caught up in what we thought was a humanitarian war to liberate the Kosovars from the dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic. But I think when we look at the history of this entire period, starting in the early 90s, we understand that this is part of a war agenda, and there are several stages in this war agenda. Certainly Yugoslavia was one stage, and Yugoslavia was very important as a stepstone into into the Afghan as well as into the Iraqi war for political, geopolitical, economic, strategic reasons. We know also that the Balkans is an important corridor for pipelines, for transportation. It is the gateway into the Middle East. But if you look at national security documents, you realize that all these wars are part of the same design. They're part of the same, they emanate from the same military doctrine. And this is now abundantly clear when we look at what is called the Project for the New American Century, which is this blueprint of global domination, which was published before the accession of Bush to the White House. It is essentially a blueprint. It identifies the stages of this war. If we look at national security documents going back to the Clinton administration, we have evidence that the war in Iraq was already planned. The Central Command documents, which are part of military strategy, which say very explicitly, Iraq is first, then Iran, extending from the tip of Saudi Arabia up to the Caspian Sea basin. You have a region which encompasses approximately 70% of the world's supplies of oil and natural gas. Saudi Arabia, 26%, Iraq, 11% of total world reserves. That is 5 times those of the United States. And this ultimately is the objective of this war. It is to secure access, control, and ownership over these reserves. It's not the only objective, but it is certainly a key objective. And this region is strategic. And it's not only Iraq, it's the broader region. Now, if you look at this region, you'll notice that it is heavily militarized in the sense that each of these little planes indicates a U.S. military presence. Since the war in Yugoslavia, specifically 1999, with the outbreak of the air campaign, NATO signed an agreement with several former Soviet republics, which is called the GUAM: Georgia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. Explicitly, this military agreement was to protect and secure oil pipelines from the Caspian Sea basin back to Western markets. And in fact, it's very important to understand that these pipeline routes, they transit Well, they transit across the Caucasus, and then they also transit across the Balkans. And one group of countries which is very important is Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Albania, which is also a pipeline project controlled by the same multinational companies. And there you can see that the civil war which broke out in Macedonia in late 2001 was instigated actually by the CIA and by the U.S. military, always using Al-Qaeda as an instrument, as an intelligence asset to create conditions which ultimately lead to the destabilization of these countries. And in the case of Macedonia, we know now for a fact that not only had you senior military advisors working with Islamic terrorists, which were integrated into the KLA. In other words, there was a direct collaboration between the U.S. military on the one hand and the Mujahideen, financed by Al-Qaeda, on the other. And it is amply documented that this collaboration took place. So we see that, and I'll try to go through several of the stages of this process. We see that on the one hand, the war is based on securing oil. It's based on securing control over people and institutions. It is also there's also a rivalry between the Anglo-American coalition on the one hand and what the U.S. media has called Old Europe, which is essentially the alliance between France and Germany. And that confrontation is not in any way limited to the arena of diplomacy, to the Security Council of the United Nations. It's a much deeper division, which has to do with the fact that the oil industry is split down the middle, with the Anglo-American conglomerates on the one hand. British Petroleum now is integrated into the U.S. oil industry with the merger of British Petroleum and Amoco. And then you have the giant Franco-Belgian conglomerate Total-Fina-Elf, which is competing for markets in this region, which is also supported by Germany. You have the Russian oil conglomerate. In other words, what we are looking at is a big divide. It's a confrontation between great powers in the areas of oil, but not exclusively. It is also in the military-industrial complex, where you have now an integration of British defense interests with those of the United States. And this explains the relationship between the two governments. It has nothing to do with Tony Blair or George W. Okay? It has to do with the fact that British Aerospace Systems is now part of the U.S. defense procurement system. Okay? It has exactly the same privileges as the Big Five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and so on. Okay? So essentially we're dealing with the Big Six. So there's an integration at the level of defense production. There's an integration in the oil industry. There's consultations and integration at the level of the military and the intelligence, with the MI5, MI6 collaborating with their counterparts, and so on. So that is what creates this military coalition. And very crucial, it is also the confrontation between competing monetary systems, namely the confrontation between the almighty US dollar on the one hand and the new global currency, which is the euro. This confrontation for control over currency systems is something which is very important, particularly in this region. The United States wants to ensure that the euro as a new global currency, dominated by the large German banks, the Deutsche Landbank, the Deutsche Bank, the big French and Italian handful of European banks, essentially the European Central Bank located in Frankfurt is a project of the German financial establishment. And so that you have a clash in the oil industry, you have a clash in financial institutions. It's very complex. There are lots of overlapping and cross-cutting allegiances. And then you have this split in the defense industry where you have British Aerospace Systems integrated with the big five defense contractors. Incidentally, Canada is part of that through the defense agreements and production sharing arrangements between the two countries. And then you have in Europe what is called the European Air Defense System Corporation, EADS, which is the integration of Aerospatiale Matra, the French conglomerate on the one hand, and Deutsche Aerospace, which is a subsidiary of the powerful Daimler Group. And this has formed a very powerful competing defense conglomerate which does not have access to the U.S. system of procurement, and therefore there's also competition in the production of weaponry. So you have essentially, I mean, these are not all the sectors in which there's conflict between these two economic blocks, but defense industry, oil, and currency systems are the main ones. And this hidden war particularly the hidden war between the United States and France is something which goes back to the early 90s. It's certainly visible, although it's not reported in the media, in Central Africa, in the Rwandan Civil War, in the Congo, but also in West Africa, and it involves the confrontation of the old colonial powers, particularly France in this case, because Britain is allied with the United States, and the United States, which is establishing itself a colonial empire in Africa, using again triggering civil wars through covert operations and so on. All these things have been documented and studied, but they're not well understood and they're not discussed in the newspapers. So that we are dealing with blueprints for global economic, political domination. This region, as I mentioned, is strategic because it borders onto China. Afghanistan has a border with China. Afghanistan is now heavily militarized. Several of the former Soviet republics bordering onto China's western frontier. Similarly, in recent years, there's been a militarization of the South China Sea. Essentially, it's no secret to anybody in the military intelligence community, the ultimate rogue enemies are China and Russia. And this is not simply based on any kind of, this is not based on a hypothesis. When just about a year ago, more than a year ago, a year and a half ago, in February of 2002, the United States issued what was called its Nuclear Posture Review. And the Nuclear Posture Review was a redefinition of its nuclear policy, and it says we are now going to use nuclear weapons on a preemptive basis to protect ourselves against the rogue enemies. And they actually listed in the statement of this Nuclear Posture Review, they listed, of course, the well-known rogue enemies, the rogue states, Iran, Iraq, Syria, North Korea, Libya, but they also included Russia and China, okay, as stating very clearly that
that nuclear weapons are directed, nuclear warheads are directed to these countries, which in principle are supposed to be friends of America, at least officially. Now, another important development in this nuclear posture review happened on the 6th of August 2003, which happens to be Hiroshima Day, 58 years ago. A secret meeting was held at the Okhud Central Command base in Nebraska, which is really the big sort of military base. They invited representatives from the private sector, Wall Street, etc., to discuss the development of nuclear weapons for preemptive use. And there's been a whole propaganda campaign which has been launched already even before the war in Iraq, that the new generation of tactical nuclear weapons, the so-called mini nukes, are harmless to civilians, etc., because the explosion is underground, etc. No discussion of radiation effects of these nuclear warheads. The mini nukes, they sound like harmless toys, but they have an explosive capacity which varies between 1/3 to 6 times a Hiroshima bomb. And they are to be used in theater warfare, alongside conventional weapons. Their delivery system is similar to that of these so-called bunker buster bombs. And it's interesting, if you read the press carefully, you will have noticed that barely a couple of weeks before President Bush's famous State of the Union address, which was back in February of this year, a White House spokesman said, we will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if we are attacked with weapons of mass destruction. Okay? That was an official statement of the White House. Now, what's his name? The British Minister of Defense, what's his name? Hoon, made the same statement, made exactly the same statement to the House of Commons prior to the war in Iraq, but his statement was much more explicit and even more frightening, because he said, we will not hesitate to use our Trident nuclear weapons if we are attacked with weapons of mass destruction, knowing, of course, that the weapons of mass destruction were non-existent. Okay? Because after all, that intelligence was known at the time, and we knew it, and everybody else knew it. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that nuclear war is part of is a military assumption. It is now being developed. It is being developed with the private sector because there's money to be made in that. Of course, we also have, if you look at this broader region, you also come to realize that we're not strictly talking about the nuclear capabilities of Britain or the United States, which in any event constitute the main threat. But we're talking about Israel, which, for the record, in fact, is more advanced than Britain. It's the 5th nuclear power in the world today, not officially, but in terms of the scientific assessment of their capabilities and sophistication is that they're more advanced than Britain in their nuclear technology, and all of the Israeli warheads are pointed to cities in the Middle East as well as Russia. Okay, and so we have here a situation where the war has extended from Afghanistan to Iraq, and now one is hinting that the next stage is Iran, and it's already included in the blueprint of the PNAC, because the PNAC says very explicitly that we will engage in theater wars. And we will win successive theater wars. Okay? And, the PNAC's objective is to, quote, fight and decisively win in multiple simultaneous theater wars. This as a means to achieve the objective of Pax Americana. The war agenda does not stop with Iraq. It is part of a continuous process. It is a project of world domination. There's no question about it. And it ultimately targets China and Russia. It also, in a sense, also targets the European Union. At least its objective is to gain economic and political dominance in relation to competing world powers. So that, in history, this kind of situation emerges. It's a confrontation between competing empires, and I think we have to understand it in that particular way. And that's why I try to look at it in terms of the various underlying objectives of this war, which is petroleum. It's clear that anybody who gains control over 70% of the world's supplies of oil has a tremendous leverage in relation to any other competing economic power in the world. Okay, and that is certainly one of the objectives of this war. Now, all this is happening at a period of at a very important juncture in our history. It's certainly the most severe economic, political, and social crisis of the modern era. There's no question about that. It is accompanied by a major collapse in living standards all over the world, a globalization of poverty, which is not due to scarcity of resources, lack of means, precisely the opposite. It's expansion through destruction. It's the displacement of national economies, local economies, through deregulation, privatization, and so on. Okay? And now, for those of you who followed the Iraqi privatization program, which has emerged from one day to the next, I think it's very important to stress that everything is privatized with 100% ownership except oil, okay? Except natural resources. But that includes banking, it includes services, education, health, etc. It is no longer something which is negotiated with the IMF. Okay? We might one day feel very nostalgic in relation to the IMF's deadly economic medicine, which was imposed on countries, negotiated and imposed on countries in a multilateral framework. We're not dealing with that. We're not dealing with the World Trade Organization. We're dealing with a finance minister and a minister of trade of Iraq, which emerged from one day to the next, okay? And who then go off to Dubai to a World Bank meeting, and then the following week they're off to the OPEC meetings representing Iraq. When we know for a fact that these people are stooges of the United States. And they're instruments of the United States military intelligence apparatus. But on the other hand, the type of arrangement which is now being put in place in Iraq is not a multilateral type of thing where you have creditors coming in with the World Bank and so on. It is a colonial structure where the U.S. government and the U.S. Treasury will set the stage for how the economy is going to be revamped. And in fact, it's interesting in this particular context that a spokesman for the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, actually said, well, they weren't even informed of this privatization program until it was announced. Okay? Which suggests that America is not consulting its partner in the coalition, which is technically involved in this coalition provisional authority, the so-called CPA, which is the body which administers Iraq. It appears that Britain in this case was not informed. An unfolding economic crisis within our own economies, which is triggered by the massive redirection of resources to the military-industrial complex and the war economy. We can see it happening. There's a run on the dollar. We can see the tremendous shift from the civilian sectors into the military. The implications of this war economy on social services is likely to be absolutely devastating. We can see also massive budget deficits accumulating due to the expansion of military budgets, and contrary to the 1930s, because I think we have to also start comparing this situation with that of the 1930s in Germany. Okay? This is a movement towards fascism. It's a slide towards fascism. It is supported on the militarization on the outside, internationally. Inside, it is the establishment of the police state under the Patriot legislation. This police state apparatus is unfolding, and in fact, what you have is the militarization of civilian institutions. We brought out a very interesting study in the magazine, which has to do with the fact that in the United States, they're repealing legislation which prevents the military from entering into the spheres of civilian police and justice. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act. It goes back to the Civil War. It's a very fundamental principle that the Pentagon, that the military do not intervene in police functions or in the judicial. And what is happening is that this legislation is being repealed, and we are now seeing the militarization of civilian institutions. So that de facto we have a military government in the United States. Let's face it. Because George W. is not the person who is pulling the strings. His understanding of foreign policy is very limited. I don't know what the standards are at McMaster University, but I guess they're the same as they are at the U of O, but well, maybe higher. But in any event, George W. would not have made his honors BA in international affairs at any Canadian university with this kind of perspective. The guy does not know where Afghanistan is, okay? And he is briefed on a daily basis by CIA Director George Tenet. So again, we talk about political puppets. Well, we have these public relations puppets. And quite frankly, I prefer George W. to Wesley Clark, okay? I mean, if I had to choose, if it ever came down to that. Because Wesley Clark is actually a very much more astute military man, who is responsible for war crimes in the Balkans, for having ordered the destruction of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools. We have it well documented that Wesley Clark is a war criminal, and George W. is just a puppet. Now, how does all this relate to September 11th? Okay? Well, it relates in a very direct way, because in every political statement by the Bush administration. 9/11 is the justification for waging these wars. It's the war on terror. And the war on terror is part of the national security doctrine. And the war on terror, the military campaign against Afghanistan, was decided on the evening of 9/11. On September 11, at 11 o'clock at night, they had decided to wage war on Afghanistan, and the justification and the pretext was that Al-Qaeda had attacked the World Trade Center. If you go through the documents and the chronology, it's discussed in my book, where I provide a review of the meetings which were held on that evening. That decision was made. Perhaps it was made well before. Okay, it was probably made several years before, because you don't simply improvise a war in Afghanistan from one month to the next. Okay, but let's say that it was made public on September 11, or at least in the morning papers of September 12th, and it was and the news dispatches were sent out on that same evening. And since then, we have seen that 9/11 is the whole basis for virtually every kind of political foreign affairs initiative, as well as all the measures which are taken internally, the repeal of legislation, the establishment of the police state, the procedures to arrest people without trial, and so on. All this is based ultimately on 9/11 and on the mythical figure of Osama bin Laden. Everybody says Al-Qaeda is behind these terrorist attacks. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether Al-Qaeda is behind these terrorist attacks. I won't necessarily get into that. But I think what must be understood is that Al-Qaeda is not an outside enemy. Okay? Al-Qaeda is a creation of U.S. foreign policy. And is what the CIA calls an intelligence asset. The Al-Qaeda, which means the base, or the origins of Al-Qaeda go back to the Soviet-Afghan War. It was a CIA initiative to recruit Islamic brigades, setting up the madrasas, in other words, the Quranic schools, the training camps in Afghanistan in the context of the Soviet-Afghan War. This was a Cold War initiative. It was launched under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, for which he got the Nobel Prize. Okay. Now, you might say, so in other words, Jimmy Carter, the Carter administration launched a secret operation. The National Security Advisor was Brzezinski, and they created Al-Qaeda. They created the Islamic Brigades. And Brzezinski doesn't actually deny it. I have an interview here. He says, yes, it was an excellent idea to do that. You know, we funded the brigades. We brought in the Wahhabi sects from Saudi Arabia, which set up the training camps, and then it was financed by drug money and so on and so forth. All this is documented. Actually, nobody, even within the CIA, will actually deny it. But the official story is he went against us. We supported Osama. We supported Al-Qaeda. It was for a worthy cause. It was during the Cold War. And in the post-war era, Al-Qaeda has turned on its sponsors. In intelligence jargon, that is called the blowback. It's when an intelligence asset goes against the sponsors, which in this case is the American intelligence apparatus. So that essentially the CIA is the ill-fated victim of this, with Osama going against us. Okay? And that is in a sense, it's a missing link, because the blowback says, yes, it is an outside enemy. We helped them initially. He went against us. They can't deny the historical record. But I can tell you that this is simply a big lie. And it's not so much, I mean, the lie has got to be so big. It's not the question of whether there was foreknowledge, okay, of the 9/11 attacks. It has to do with the fact that Al-Qaeda is a creature of the CIA and has remained a creature of the CIA right up until the present. And that is simply not, it's not a question again of saying yes, maybe. Okay? It is something which is so well documented from official sources. Now, I'm going to read you a quote, and I would like you to guess the source of this quote. Okay? It refers to the early to mid-90s in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where, as you know, Al-Qaeda was active in supporting the Bosnian Muslim army, bringing in mujahideen and weapons financed by various sources, but essentially this was part of Al-Qaeda. And the report says the following: the Clinton administration's hand-on involvement with Islamic networks' arms pipeline included inspection of missiles by U.S. government officials. The Third World Relief Agency, a Sudan-based phony humanitarian organization, was a major link in the arms pipeline to Bosnia. TWRA is believed to be connected with Osama bin Laden. So there you have the Clinton administration collaborating with an organization which has links to Al-Qaeda. Now, what's the source of this document? Pardon? It's the U.S. Congress. It's the Republican Party. In other words, the Republican Party, it's a 1997 document. In 1997, the Republican Party was accusing the Clinton administration of collaborating with Al-Qaeda. This document is a public document, but it was not. They decided to keep it, more or less private to themselves, because they wanted to discredit Clinton for his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Okay, and I know that there was discussion within the Republican Party to trigger an Osama Gate, a Bosnia Gate, Osama scandal, which would then backlash on the Clinton administration and accuse Clinton of collaborating with Islamic terrorists. Okay? A bit like the Iran-Contra scandal. And it was decided within the Republican Party not to pursue that particular course, because that was their course. That was the continuity of foreign policy right from the beginning. Okay? And it could backlash and it would destroy the continuity. So they preferred to go for the easy Monica Lewinsky scandal, which would denigrate and discredit the administration for something which is admittedly not as serious as collaborating with the terrorists. Okay? But I mean, we have numerous evidence. We have many points of evidence of collaboration between agencies of the U.S. government, the military and intelligence in particular, on the one hand, and the Al-Qaeda network. These do not date back to a bygone era. They go back to 2001 or 2000, at least the last firmly documented joint military operation between Al-Qaeda and the Pentagon dates to August 2001, barely a month before the 9/11 attack, where in the context of the civil war in Macedonia, where you had within the same paramilitary formation, terrorist paramilitary formation, so-called National Liberation Army, you had mujahideen sent in by Al-Qaeda with senior military officers detached by the Pentagon who were there under a contract with Military Professional Resources, a private mercenary company, but they were U.S. military. Okay? And they were working together. We have the photographs and we have statements by the Macedonian Prime Minister which actually accuses the United States of supporting terrorism. And there's absolutely no doubt that these things took place. And we have congressional records and so on. Okay? And in that process, and that's very important, it's outlined in the diagram, there is a long-standing historical relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI. Now, the ISI was essentially the go-between in the operation launched in the early 80s, first under Carter, then under Reagan. Several secret directives were issued, national security decision directives were issued under Reagan to provide support to the Islamic brigades, and it was done through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, acting as a go-between. So that in a sense, Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence has always acted in a sense as a subsidiary of the CIA. And that relationship, incidentally, was never severed. The relationship between Pakistan's ISI and the CIA has never been severed. And on the other hand, Pakistan's ISI continues to this date to support Islamic terrorist organizations in different parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, even in the western province of China, and they are doing this on behalf of their counterparts in the CIA. Okay, the ISI is leading these covert operations, terrorist organizations, in favor of terrorist organizations, and they're doing it while maintaining very close bilateral ties with their U.S. counterparts in Langley, namely the CIA. And that background has to be understood. Now, we have reason to believe that Pakistan's ISI is part of the 9/11 conspiracy. And this is not, and at the same time, Pakistan's ISI has links to the CIA and to the Pentagon. In late September 2001, there was an FBI report. I'm always quoting official sources because, again, people can't say, then they'll say you're conspiracy theorists when you quote official sources, okay? Well, I say yes. But the FBI is a good source. Now, in late September 2001, the FBI issued a statement to the effect that unnamed sources in Pakistan were financing the terrorists, Al-Qaeda. The relationship is documented by other sources, including the Council of Foreign Relations. But then that statement by the FBI was then later confirmed that the money transfers which were sent out of Pakistan by the ISI had been ordered by the head of the agency, General Mahmoud Ahmad. In other words, the FBI confirmed that there was an undercover role whereby Pakistan's inter-services intelligence transferred money to the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks, Mohammed Atta. This came out in the press report, and the report itself was commented on network television. And they speak in the FBI report of the money man, the mastermind, the financiers behind the terrorists. And in a subsequent report, the name of the head of Pakistan's inter-services intelligence is actually mentioned as him having given the order to transfer this money to the alleged terrorists of 9/11. The alleged money man was on an official visit to Washington at the time when these attacks occurred. So here you are. This is, so please understand a little bit the linkages. The FBI states, has a report which suggests that Pakistan's ISI and the head of Pakistan's ISI is the institutional architect and financier behind the terrorists. Okay? Yet the same individual which is identified in these reports, and there were several other reports, one of Indian intelligence, is on an official visit to Washington. In other words, the money man behind the terrorists, General Mahmoud Ahmad, which is head of Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, an organization which has continued to support terrorist organizations for the last 20 or 30 years, since the early 80s, is on an official visit to Washington from the 4th to the 13th of September. On the 9th of September, the leader of the Northern Alliance, General Shah Massoud, is assassinated. It's a kamikaze assassination 2 days before 9/11. And the official statement of the Northern Alliance, which was transmitted to the U.S. government, accuses the ISI of having instigated this assassination. Okay? Now, it just so happens that not only the head of that organization, which allegedly, according to the Northern Alliance, instigated the assassination of Shah Massoud, but also the individual who is identified in the FBI report as the money man behind the terrorists, was on an official visit to Washington from the 4th to the 13th of September. And it's interesting that all this, of course, is very carefully acknowledged by the U.S. media. In fact, the Washington Post states very clearly in an editorial which came several months later, they point to the fact that this general who was met at the very senior levels of the Bush administration, meeting Colin Powell, he met Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, George Tenet, etc., and he also met the two individuals who are now in charge of the inquiry, Senator Bob Graham and Representative Porter Goss. Okay? And it just so happens that on the morning of 9/11, the two individuals who are now entrusted with that investigation and who have produced this 800 or 900 page report with 28 missing pages, well, these individuals were having breakfast with the money man on the morning of 9/11. The U.S. media gives us the evidence that the ISI is behind it. The Council on Foreign Relations has documented it. but they don't connect the dots to the extent that they say, how come this money man is received red carpet treatment in Washington and meets virtually everybody in the Congress and the Bush administration and so on and so forth. And then, on the morning of the 12th, well actually on two successive meetings, the 12th and the 13th, he meets Colin Powell and Richard Armitage, and he's invited into the State Department on the 13th to discuss the terms of Pakistan's cooperation in the war on terrorism. Okay? So bear in mind, you have this money man behind 9/11 is invited into Colin Powell's office, and there they discuss how the money man can help in going after terrorists. It's a bit like asking Al Capone to help in going after organized crime. It's the same procedure, but in other words, Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, which is the institution behind these terrorist organizations, is also the organization which ultimately is going to serve the interests of the U.S. government in going after the terrorists. And the conclusion one draws, apart from all the other evidence which has accumulated, the stand-down orders, the mystery surrounding the collapse of the World Trade Towers, the collapse of WTC 7, for instance, which is shrouded in mystery, the cover-ups, and so on and so forth. All of this suggests that, first of all, that the foreknowledge issue is a red herring. Okay, it's there to mislead people, because what it does is it says, oh yes, well there were failures, intelligence lapses, etc. The FBI didn't do its job, or the CIA we didn't know, but we didn't know when they were going to hit us, etc. Of course they knew. Okay? Intelligence assets which collaborate with the U.S. intelligence apparatus are known to their sponsors. This is not an outside enemy, it is an inside enemy. Even if these groups have a certain degree of autonomy, they are instruments of U.S. foreign policy, the instruments of the U.S. military intelligence apparatus. On the 10th of September, Osama bin Laden was admitted to the military hospital in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. Now, anybody who's been to Rawalpindi knows that it's swarming with U.S. military advisors. Okay? The whole place it's the base of the Pakistani military and so on. And nobody of that stature, Osama bin Laden, would be able to enter into the hospital without some connections at the very senior levels of the military intelligence apparatus. And of course, you can always claim a reward. Okay? Now, that piece of news, of course, very, very important, because it refutes all the statements made by Donald Rumsfeld, who says, well, we don't know where he is. It's like looking for a needle in a stack of hay. You've heard that several times, right? Says, well, we don't know. Maybe he's in Afghanistan. We don't know where he is. Well, this report confirms, and I think it's a reliable report, because it's my favorite anchorman, Dan Rather, CBS News, reporting from Rawalpindi, Pakistan. Now you see, Dan Rather again does not draw the implications of his report. He goes to the hospital, interviews the people, sends back the images and so on. We have the transcripts of this report, and he says, here, Dan Rather reporting from Rawalpindi, Osama was hospitalized on the 10th, and that was only 24 hours before the 9/11 attack. And then but he doesn't connect the dots and say, well, Donald Rumsfeld is a big liar, okay? Because if Dan Rather says that he was there, either Dan Rather is a liar or Donald Rumsfeld is a liar. Somebody is lying, okay? But if Osama was there one day before these attacks, we could have gone in and arrested him in his hospital bed in Rawalpindi, and this would have saved a lot of time and energy and so on and so forth. But obviously that was not part of the agenda which the US military intelligence establishment wants to achieve. So what these incidents suggest is in effect that the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden, this mythical figure, are known to the intelligence community, have always been known. He could have been arrested on numerous occasions. The history suggests that Al-Qaeda is an organization which was created by the CIA, and that those links have been sustained ever since. And it makes a tremendous difference in the way we understand these events. We have to understand that the war on terrorism is fabricated. It is a complete fabrication. But at the same time, it is the doctrine which justifies all these actions, both internally and internationally. The police state inside, the militarization of the Middle East and Central Asia, on the other hand, is part of the national security doctrine. It is a big lie. And it's perhaps the biggest lie in US history, and it is absolutely essential that a consistent anti-war movement reveal the lie. We can't simply go around saying, and that's why I say the war and 9/11 have a relationship, because 9/11 is the basis which justifies the war on terrorism and this war of conquest. And you might find people, even among progressive organizations in Canada, who say, well, I think I'm against the war in Iraq, but I think we should go after this guy Osama bin Laden. Okay, we have to weed out the terrorists. I think that's I support Bush on the terrorist thing, but I don't think we should invade Iraq, etc., etc. And bear in mind that throughout the propaganda campaign was to try to establish links between terrorists and their sponsors, namely the Iraqi authorities. And so that you had a very consistent propaganda campaign which was there day after day telling us that America is under threat and so on and so forth. And in the last speech of Bush in the General Assembly, and his previous speech that he made a few weeks ago, he is now using a new term which is called the civilized world. Okay, we are the civilized world. So this, I think, is essential that we build this understanding, that it be part of a consistent anti-war movement. An anti-war movement cannot be based solely on anti-war rallies. We have to consistently create an organizational structure, a network which spreads across the land, of grassroots, educate our fellow citizens, spread the word, establish committees at the local level, perhaps a far less dramatic way of building an anti-war movement. And because what happens with these big rallies, they take place, and then subsequently people go home, feel good that they've done something, but we need the organizational structures. We have to question the legitimacy of the main political and military actors behind this war project.